you. But this is a lesson that if you'll stick with it for a few minutes, you will hopefully understand something that you've never even tried to understand before. This is a subject that doesn't really ever get talked about. It's a subject you haven't heard before. It's a subject you might not hear again. But the subject is created kinds within what the Bible has to say about them. Let me start by looking at the verse that was read for us in Genesis 1, and we'll start to try to get this idea of what we're talking about. In Genesis chapter 1, several places in the chapter, but in particular, we can look at verse 24 and 25. It says that when God created these things, He brought forth these living creatures according to their kind. Cattle and creeping things and beasts of the earth, each according to its kind. Verse 25, you see the same thing. God made beasts according to their kind, cattle according to their kind, everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind. Well, that word gets thrown around a lot here in Genesis. Also, we'll see it in the law. You can find it in some of the prophets even. And so why is it that the Bible uses this particular word? And what is it that the author here is trying to get across to us? The other question that kind of sparked this whole idea in my own mind was a pretty simple question, but a question that I don't know that a lot of us could give the answer to, which is this: did God create tigers? What is the answer to that question? Well, in a sense, you'd have to say yes, but in another sense, did God create them during the creation week? Well, that might be a whole different story. We're going to take a look at that as we go through. None of this is strange. It just may be strange to us to hear. So we're going to start by defining a couple terms. The first term is evolution, okay? When we talk about evolution at its simplest is a model for how life appears today and how it got to this point. So what I'm saying is that some scientists have suggested that evolution is a possible way that life came to be as we see it today. And of course the suggestion is that over the course of billions of years that beneficial mutations occurred, and that those mutations would add genetic information to an animal, and that it would evolve, it would gain new things over time, new organs, new features that it didn't have before. That's the idea of evolution. On the other hand, evolutionism, if you add that ism to it, that is the belief that evolution is true and that it is the factor that is responsible for life as it occurs today. So evolution is the scientific model that's suggested as a possibility. Evolutionism takes it a step farther and says that's exactly what happened. Okay, take that now from our perspective. If you talk about creationism, what is that? Well, that is the belief that the universe was created supernaturally, which is exactly what we believe, of course. But what is it from our perspective that lines up not just with evolutionism, that belief, but what lines up with the scientific model for how life appears today? We don't talk about that very often, or almost ever, but how did life come from the Garden of Eden to where it is now? And that question runs straight through this word that's going to occur over and over again here of kinds. And so we're going to try to identify exactly what a kind is according to Scripture, and even more than that, we'll try to figure out what that means or what implications that has for our beliefs. The study of this topic, I'm going to throw this word out there and then you can forget the word because the word itself is not necessarily that important, but the word is baraminology. And it comes from a Hebrew word, or two Hebrew words, one meaning created, the other meaning kind. So baraminology, but it's just the study of this topic that we're talking about tonight. That being said, this topic is understudied. It's not given a whole lot of attention, even though, like we're saying, it's kind of the necessary item that we need to combat the idea of evolution. If we're going to say evolution is false, we need to be able to explain from the Christian perspective exactly what has happened. So we look at this idea, though, of baraminology, and we're trying to figure out not only this model for how life developed, but also what kinds God originally created. And we'll talk, of course, a lot more about this as we go through. The other part of this, though, is that this isn't a new idea by any means. In fact, the father of modern taxonomy, another big word, but he's a Swedish man who lived in the 1700s named Carl Linnaeus. If you've ever heard Latin names given to describe something very simple, you would just call it a cat, but instead somebody uses a couple of Latin words. That's where it comes from. Is this individual who sought to organize animals into categories. Well, he was a believer in God, in the Bible, and so his goal was not just to organize these animals and these plants, but to organize them according to kind. That was his goal. He was trying to figure out, well, what kinds do these fit into? And that's what we're trying to do even still. So let's talk a little bit about this and try to figure out about these created kinds. First off, what do we mean when we say kind, a created kind? As we mean that today, it would be something like this. That a created kind is a group of descendants from a common ancestor. And so take your pick of whatever group you want, but you can try to figure out what belongs in that group and what does not belong in that group. We'll take a very basic example. We'll try to keep things pretty simple. We'll take the example of dogs. So dogs, if you think of dogs in general, domestic dogs, you understand that they're all connected to one another. So whether it's a pug or it's a Great Dane, they are dogs. Okay, simple enough. But is there anything else that fits within that group that's pretty clearly connected based on physical appearance, based on genetics? And the answer to that is yes. We can add to that group things that are not domestic dogs, but things like foxes or coyotes or wolves or dingoes and other places. But you take this group and you say, these things are genetically close enough and physiologically close enough that they appear to be of the same kind as you would find written out in Scripture. And you could say the same thing about a lot of different groups, and we'll try to categorize just a few of these tonight. But the question would be this, well, how do you know what is within a certain group and what is excluded from that group? The answer to that question is multi-level, and I'll give you some of the suggestions, and you can try to take it from there. One of these suggestions is interbreeding. That is, if two species can breed, that they are of the same kind. If they can produce viable offspring, they're of the same kind. Even if that offspring is not necessarily able to reproduce after that. So you think of a donkey and a horse, and we would say from that a donkey is still part of the horse kind because they're able to interbreed. So that might be an example there. The only problem with this idea of interbreeding or hybridizing is that it doesn't always work in the opposite. That is, if two things cannot breed, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are incompatible. You go to the example in dogs and you say you can't really breed a Chihuahua with a Great Dane. It's just not going to work. And so are they not two dogs of the same kind? Well, yes, they are. But because of a lot of physical changes, it won't happen anymore that way. And you see this in animals. You see this also in plants. Go back to Genesis chapter 1. The first mention of kinds is actually not about animals, but is about plants. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 11, says, Then God said, Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind, whose seed is in itself on the earth, and it was so. So there you have another mention of kind, but this time as applied to trees. So again, certain trees can interbreed, whether you recognize or have ever thought about that. But you take two species of trees that are pretty closely related, and they will readily form hybrids of themselves. So that can be evidence of them being a kind, but then sometimes, I'll use as an example, the white oak group and the red oak group, they don't interbreed. Well, does that mean that they're not related to one another? Well, of course they are. You look at everything about them, and you have to say, it doesn't make sense. There's no common sense behind saying that these are two different created kinds. And a lot of this does come down to common sense as well. So interbreeding is one example. Maybe the simplest one, though, is just morphology, which is a big word that means how they look. So there are 18 different species of penguin in the world. But if I show you a picture of a penguin, you can probably tell me it's a penguin. You might not be able to identify the species, but you can tell me it's a penguin because they kind of look alike. Well, that's all we're saying when it comes to morphology. that whenever you're trying to group animals into a category of what they might have descended from that God originally created, he created something that looked like a penguin. And that's why we have penguins today. The third thing is genetics. Of course, that's a little bit of a newer field, and so there's still a lot of study being done there, but do they share a lot of DNA? Even that can be misleading. Of course, you've heard from an evolutionist perspective that humans share a lot of DNA with great apes, and so there's a theorized connection there. Well, that doesn't always work, and we would even expect there to be a lot of overlap because there is a similarity from the designer's perspective, and we'll talk more about that too. So what exactly is a kind? Well, again, it's a group of descendants from one common ancestor that God originally created, but it's all of the members of that group. So again, to give the simplest example we can talk about cats as well as dogs. And so you look at cats and you say, well, domestic cats are cats. There's not nearly as much variety in breeds in cats as there is in dogs, but there are domestic cats, but there's also tigers, and there's ocelots, and there's lions and panthers, and there's all kinds of cats out there in the world, and yet, while they are diverse, especially in size, they pretty much look like cats, and if you watch them, they pretty much act like cats too. So there's not that much difference. But that being said, not every kind is necessarily as limited as a cat or a dog. For example, it is expected that there are about 5 different kinds of created turtles. Now, that's not from my own study, obviously, but you do think about it for a second. You think, well, the turtle in my backyard is awfully different from a sea turtle. And so you can understand maybe there are big enough differences. So why would there still be so much similarity between these different kinds of turtles? Well, if I ask you, a few of you would do a little bit better, but if I ask you to draw 5 pictures of a house, most of your houses would probably look pretty similar. I mean, especially your 5 houses that you drew. We have the same designer behind all of this. And so if he decides that it's necessary to create 2 species or 2 kinds that look similar but have different functions, he is well within his power to do that. And so we might end up with things that have some overlap because of the designer himself. Part of the whole reason that we're talking about kinds is because God identifies at the very beginning that when he created things, he created them according to their kind. But not only then, you go a little bit farther into the book of Genesis, and what happens? Noah brings 2 of each kind onto the ark, which means that whatever kinds were created in Genesis, they were preserved by Noah when he brought them onto the ark. One of the arguments that's long been made against the existence of the ark is that if you tried to fit every species that is in existence today onto the ark, you would run out of room in a hurry. But what if you tried to fit every kind? As we've said, the dog kind includes about half a dozen or more things that we can think of off the top of our head that are all really just one. So you don't need 12 different dogs, you just need 2. And so you start to shrink that number significantly. And we'll talk a little bit more about that toward the end of the lesson. Go with me to Leviticus chapter 11. Leviticus chapter 11, and like I mentioned, there are some examples in the law where we get to mention kinds as well. In Leviticus chapter 11, this will be verse 14. It mentions these are things that are clean and unclean, things that can be eaten and cannot. Leviticus 11:14, the kite and the falcon after its kind, every raven after its kind, the ostrich, the short-eared owl, and the seagull and the hawk after its kind. And you can kind of keep reading through this. I'll leave that alone for now. So you can read through the rest of these examples, but what we find is that we still have these different kinds being brought up well after the creation account and well after the days of the flood. They're still important for some reason, and they still are recognized categories by the people of God. You might say, well, is this just happenstance? Are these really connected? But remember who wrote Leviticus. It's the same person that wrote Genesis. And so when he writes kinds, he's not confusing his language here, but he's using the same identification that God gave him in the beginning. So Adam named these kinds, and Moses would name some of the same kinds that were okay to eat and some that were not. In looking at these kinds, though, the question becomes this. If everything we've said is right, or mostly right even, then we start to run into a little bit of a problem, which is that if a kind is somewhere up here, and they're a common ancestor to several different things that look different, then how do we end up with all of these differences? Or how do you end up creating species? Well, that question is a little bit misleading because species is a very modern term. Species is based almost entirely on appearance. And so a lot of times you have biologists who look at something, and if it's got a white spot on its forehead and that one doesn't, all right, new species, and I get to name it after myself. But when you look at species, there's not a whole lot of difference sometimes, and we'll talk about all that in a little bit more in just a second, but there are differences within kinds. Like we already mentioned with dogs, a dog is quite different from a wolf. There are similarities, but they are quite different. So how does that happen? And the species then that we're talking about, the species would just be a group that is similar within a kind to itself, but is different from some others in that kind. But they still ultimately come from the same place. Another way of thinking about this, and we'll make this comparison, is again with dogs. We see in dogs that there has, within the last 150 years, been a rapid process of breeding changes. For example, the Golden Retriever was first bred in 1868. And this is very specific. Lord Tweedmouth mated a yellow wavy coated retriever named Noose with a Tweed water spaniel named Belle. And that was the first Golden Retriever. And it's that specific, and we know when that happened. But the funny thing is, from a biologist's perspective, if we didn't know that it had happened then, and you discovered a Golden Retriever in the wild and you've never seen one, what would you do? You would name it a new species. But because we know where it came from, it's just a breed of dog. What we're suggesting then is that within kinds, this kind of breeding happens on its own in nature, just on a much slower timetable than it happens when it's intentionally done, like with different breeds of dogs. So this can happen, and it can happen rapidly. Within generations, you can see this kind of change. But how does it happen that quickly? This is, I think, kind of the key to understanding what we're talking about tonight, the difference between evolution and its approach to how life appears today, and this subject of created kinds, as the Bible would suggest it. Evolution requires mutation to occur and additional genetic information to be added into the equation for new features to come about. What we're talking about is almost the opposite. Instead of new genetic information needing to be added, what's actually happening is a loss of genetic information. You go back to the example of dogs, and you say, well, if you breed a Golden Retriever and a pug, which would be a terrible thing to do, but if you did that, the result would not get you any closer to the original created kind of dog. It cannot, it will not, because the genetic potential has been lost. So the change is not you've added something new, and that genetic information has been necessarily added to form new organs and new features of the animal. Instead, the animal is pretty much fully formed, and the differences are minor, but to our eyes they can appear major, but the differences are pretty minor just based off of a slight loss of genetic change over time. So with that understanding, how does that happen? And the answer to that is challenging, and I don't have all the answers, but I'll present you with some of the ideas here. What I'm saying is, how does one kind end up looking like different species over time? There are different approaches to this, different parts to this. One part is acclimation, which is, it's not by intelligence, but it is the almost adaptation to the environment that the animal is put into. It acclimates to that environment. And so it's kind of like Darwin's survival of the fittest. He wasn't wrong. The fittest do survive. He's just wrong in how much that changes over millions of years, whereas we're talking about changes within just hundreds of years potentially. But if you live in an environment that is particularly cold as an animal, and two of this particular kind breed together, and the result is that they have longer hair than the others around them, that animal is going to survive better in that environment. And if that trait is passed on, then eventually you'll end up with an animal that has longer hair that's better able to survive. Another factor is heritage mating, which is kind of a strange concept within animals. But basically it's the tendency that animals have toward mating with similar looking mates. And so if you have two dogs that have darker, longer hair, for example, then they are more likely to breed with each other rather than others. And so that's going to lead toward this kind of speciation, this kind of creation of differences within a kind. And then genetic isolation as well. Again, Darwin wasn't wrong when he observed finches on Galapagos. He wasn't wrong. He was right. The beaks are a little bit different than each other. The question is that really a different species that new genetic information was added to, or was there just one finch that over time the genetics varied a little bit and it essentially turned into a few different breeds of finch like we would think of as breeds of dogs? And that kind of thing can happen again very quickly, especially when you do have genetic isolation, whether that be a flooding event or overpopulation in certain areas or some migrate out. When you start to limit the gene pool, when you start to get individuals that look more different than individuals over here. So let's try to put a little bit of this back together, if we can. This idea of created kinds is an attempt to find out what were the first animals that God made. And from there, how did we get all the variety of animals that we see today? And so hopefully we've tried to explain that, but I feel like it might sound a little more complicated than it really is. If you want to take it more basically and figure out potentially what the kind is that you're looking at, whether you're looking at a particular animal or a particular plant, if you compare that with the current scientific method of categorizing animals, which you may or may not be familiar with, but taxonomy breaks this down according to 7 different tiers of how these animals could be connected. What you really need are just the last few of these. And so you look at the species level, and those are the individuals that are all the most different from one another. But then you go up one level and you have genus, if you remember that from your days in high school. And then above that you have the level of family. Well, it's thought that when it comes to kinds that God created, that probably 80-85% or so are on the level of family. So again, you take the example of cat and you say, well, that is the Felidae. That's the cat kind, it's just the cat family that we would look at in a science textbook. But really what we're saying is that instead of new genetic information being added to this common ancestor, that it was a common ancestor that had all the genetic potential already, and over time it became different breeds, much like dogs do today. There's not that wild of an idea there. And so we can see this in different groups. I was going to give a specific example, and I realized that it would sound even more boring coming out of my mouth than it does in my head right now. So I will save that for those who are really interested, which probably won't be anyone. So when you look at the idea of evolution versus the idea of created kinds, it's kind of like this. This is an example that people use. If you've ever seen an illustration of evolution, it's usually a tree. And the idea is that you had one common ancestor way, way, way back, a single-celled organism most of the time, that eventually branched off this way and became a fish, and this branch became a mammal, and this branch became a bird over time. And of course, we don't believe that to be true, but what's the comparison with created kinds? The comparison is that it's not one tree, but it's kind of an orchard. And so instead what you have is the cat tree over here, and you have the shark tree over here, and you have each individual tree that, yes, there are varieties that come from them, but ultimately they all go back to the same individual, but not any farther than their kind, as God created them in the creation week and as they were preserved during the flood. So a question, and there are a couple ways we can apply this. The question is, why? Why did God make different kinds? Even in the book of Genesis, in the very beginning of all of this, when God did create things, he created multiple kinds of trees. He created multiple kinds of animals, multiple kinds of fish. Why did he do that? There's probably a lot of reasons we could give, but I think the simplest comes back to his purpose for life. After the flood, in Genesis chapter 8 and verse 17, his command, as it was from the beginning, is for life to be fruitful and multiply. God, in his wisdom, knows exactly what it will take for life to be fruitful and to multiply. One of the ways that that is best suited for our world is to have genetic potential, genetic variation, biodiversity, as we would call it today. God created all of these kinds with the ability to change a little bit, to acclimate to their environment, to adapt over time as needed. And they've done just that, and it's been beneficial toward God's purpose for this. Now, you could also talk about the way that variety in animal life and in plant life makes for better resilience against disease. You could talk about the usefulness for humans as far as discoveries we've made with different animals and different plants. You could talk about just our curiosity that God may have put these things there for our benefit. But ultimately, the purpose comes back to God did this because he wanted his life to be fruitful and multiply on this earth. And he's been very successful in that. As far as applying this idea, I know this sounds like such an abstract concept, but there's a few ways that it becomes important to you and to me, just as people who believe in this book and think that it's true. First off, it has applications for a young earth timeline. That is, for an earth that's only about 6,000 years old. The whole reason that the earth is suggested to be billions of years old is because evolution, as a scientific model for why life looks the way it does today, relies on mutation, which relies on chance, which relies on billions of years to even have a possibility of working. If you can remove that from the equation, then things can shorten significantly. And if you're essentially talking about different breeds of the same animal, that can happen quite rapidly, and we would even expect it to happen rapidly after the flood, especially considering the likelihood of an ice age that takes place after that. There would be a lot of environments that have changed immediately after the flood that these animals in very short generations with their genetic potential would need to adapt to and would be able to do just that. So the suppressing of already present genetic information only takes a few generations, whereas evolution, if it were even possible, would take millions of generations over billions of years. We kind of hinted at this before, but there's an application as well for the ark. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 20, of course, it says, of the birds after their kind, of the animals after their kind, and of every creeping thing of the earth after its kind. Two of every kind will come to you to keep them alive. So notice that it says every bird, every animal after their kind, but it doesn't just mean that as a general rule, but then it specifies that two of every kind. So it's understood that within the animal kind, there are kinds within that. Within the bird kind, there are lots of kinds within that. But the accusation has been made over and over that there's no way that the ark would be able to fit all of these different species that we find today. For example, there are some 11,000 species of birds according to the way that we classify them today. Could you fit 11,000 species of birds on the ark? Maybe, just maybe, but then where are the mammals going to go? And where are the reptiles going to go? That's too many to fit. Now, consider instead how many, if you take that from the species level to the genus level to the family level, which we're saying is about the same as what a kind was when God created it, how many kinds of birds, how many families of birds are there? There's 294. Is that a little bit easier to fit than 11,000? Well, of course it is. You do the same thing with mammals. There's about 300 different kinds of mammals. And even if some of those are pretty big, a lot of them are not so big, and you're not going to run out of room at all when it comes to the ark. So it does make a difference in the way that we understand the ark. But the other difference that it makes, and the reason that it became an important question to me, is because it makes a difference in the designer. What did God create? Did God create a tiger? Well, God didn't create a tiger. God created a cat. And whatever that cat looked like, it had the potential to become a tiger, and it did become a tiger. But he didn't create the tiger first thing. And imagine Adam, how many days it would have taken him if he had to name every species that we see today. But that's not what he had to do. And just like Noah didn't have to fit every species on the ark, but only every family. So what does that mean, though? If God didn't create the tiger, but he created a cat with the potential for the tiger and the panther and the cheetah and every cat that we see today, what difference does that make? The difference is sort of similar to what we see in the physical landscape of the world. If you've ever been to some of the most impressive places in just the United States, we'll say, if you've ever been to Niagara Falls, if you've ever been to the Grand Canyon or the Grand Tetons, when you go to those places, you're in awe of God, right? But did God create those places? Okay, that's a fair question, right? Did God create the Grand Canyon? Was it there when the creation week happened? Of course not. Was it there before the flood? No, it couldn't have been, or it would have been wiped away with everything else. So did God create those? In one sense, you say, not exactly. But on the other hand, you say, did God create the forces that would create those things? Well, of course he did. Did God create everything necessary to create everything we've ever seen in the universe from the first week that he made anything? And of course he did. He did that not only for the physical world, for the universe as a whole, but he did that for each created kind. That over time, that eventually would become things that we see today. So did God make a tiger? No. But didn't he make something more impressive? You go to the illustration that the Hebrew author uses in Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 4. We looked at this pretty recently in class. It says, "For every house is built by someone, but he who built all things is God." Are you more impressed by somebody that could build one house or somebody that built the whole neighborhood? When we look at God, we say, are we more impressed by one species, or are we more impressed by the person who created the ability for all of these species to exist today? And hopefully that makes the point well enough to say that God is the ultimate designer, not just because he designed something that we can look at today that looks neat, but because he designed something that had so much potential to become everything that we see even today. We'll leave the lesson there, and there's more to look into in that subject if you're ever interested. If you're not, you've been introduced to the subject, but tonight we don't want to leave this opportunity without offering God's invitation. God is the designer and the creator of the world, but he has an expectation of that creation as well. That one day he will destroy this creation that he has made, that even all of these things that have been designed will be no more, but that all those who have chosen him will be safely at home with him for eternity, and those who have failed to choose him will be lost eternally. Tonight you have the opportunity to choose God. You have the opportunity to ask for any need that you have from the church. But if there's anything that can be done, now's the time to come forward as we stand and as we sing.